everyone. Bonjour. That's as far as my French goes. Let me begin firstly by honoring every single one of you in the room today and the journey that has brought you here. Whatever resilience, whatever courage, whatever madness, whatever boldness you have had to exude in order to be where you are today, I honor that. And I hope that as you sit in these chairs and you interact and you listen to the plenaries and you participate in the workshops, that you will find whatever it is that you came for here, whether it's clarity, resolve, healing maybe, that you will find it in the conversations that we will have here. But let me also say what a joy it is for me to be here. Eve is the highlight of my year. This is the third year I've been speaking at the event. And I can tell you, doing this work a lot, that it's not often that you come across a conference at this level with the subject matter, be yourself. Often we're being encouraged as leaders, consciously or subconsciously, to wear a mask, to do whatever it is that allows us to survive in the world. But this event is really about thriving and finding your authentic power. And so I hope that as we have these conversations, you find whatever it is that you are looking for. So let me begin by asking 3 grounding questions. The first is, how do you tend to inhabit your body as you navigate leadership and go through life in general? So even as you sit in the room today, just observe for yourself, notice, how is your body? Is it open? Is it explorative? Does the person next to you feel positive energy coming from you? Or is it stiff and closed? And is the person next to you almost hoping that you don't have any interaction today? But think about it even in your leadership. Is your body so upright and stable that it encourages in others and cultivates in others a confidence in you as a leader? Or is it so firm and upright that it scares the people around you and causes them to shrink in their own bodies? The second question I'll ask you is, what emotions do you tend to cultivate as you adjust to new realities? So when life changes, which it always does, do you find yourself in ambition, in acceptance? Do you find yourself looking for the possibilities in the moment of change? Or do you become resentful and do you start to blame and do you start to look for ways in which you are negatively affected by the situations you find yourself in? And then lastly, what language do you tend to use to direct action in the world? Are the words that you use words that cultivate a sense of collaboration and togetherness? Or do you use language that creates divisiveness and dissonance in the people that follow you and in the organizations in which you lead? Now, often when I ask these questions, people say, but why such soft questions when we are having a conversation about something so hard as leadership? And here's what I say. First of all, these questions are questions about effectiveness. How can we be effective as leaders if we have not yet mastered these often invisible traits of our emotions, our body, our language? Secondly, these questions are about beingness, which is that before you show up with your very clever strategies and approaches in the spaces in which you lead, something else shows up in the room, and it is often these invisible traits. And while they're invisible and quiet, they're actually driving a lot of your actions in the world. Thirdly, these questions are important because they are questions about how we learn and change. And leadership at its core is about your capability for learning and changing. Learning is about the quality of your awareness in each leadership moment that is presented to you. And change is your ability to shift depending on whatever situation you now find yourself in as a leader. And so we will explore these questions, and what I will be driving is the realization that leadership actually is not in fact a skill. It is a form of consciousness that we act out of. And when we can let go of this idea of building skills, which is usually what creates the mask, right? When you start to imitate the leaders you think are good leaders, you will find that sometimes you will come to the end of those skills, especially in a rapidly changing world. But if you are in a space of consciousness, of deepened self-awareness, and connection to the self, you will find that you will have a plethora of leadership abilities that you can access. Otto Sharma, who is the founder of the Presencing Institute in Theory U, if you've heard of Theory U, says something quite powerful, which is that transformation is about the ability of the system to actually see itself, to deeply see the data that is available to you. And I want you and invite you to think about your body, your emotions, and your language as a data system that is available to you as a leader as you learn and change. And to illustrate this, I want to tell the story of Yemi. I met Yemi in a program similar to this one in 2014, where we were doing leadership development and personal mastery. And after a session similar to this, Yemi came to me and started to tell me about how he was struggling with the team that he had hired for a startup that he had created in Nigeria. The purpose of this startup was to change the landscape of access to medicines, and he was serving specifically communities that were underserved and unseen. He had lots of ambition, he had a big vision, it was bold, it was brave, it was courageous. But when I met with him, he was feeling anything but bold and brave and courageous. In fact, he was tired. He explained to me how he felt that his team was not participating the way that they should as part of his vision, that they were consistently looking to him for answers, that they were not creative and they were not innovative. And he always felt like he was carrying the burden of the team. Now, of course, his team wasn't in the room, so I couldn't work with his team. And so I shifted attention to him. And I wanted to understand how he was being as a leader that was creating this environment. Now, when I observed Yemi in the room, there were certain things that were very clear about him. First of all, he was very easily agitated. He was a bit of a bully. And when he spoke, he often used the word I and very rarely the word we. You also noticed that he had a lot of tension in his shoulders and was always crouched over. And when he walked, almost marched like a soldier through the room, taking up a lot of oxygen. Now, I drew his attention to this, and I wanted to figure out how he had become this way. And so Yemi and I started a conversation. And it was in this conversation that I discovered that Yemi had experienced something called the Zangon Katak killings. For those of you who are from Nigeria, you may recognize this in Kaduna, when he was 7 years old. And in these killings, he had seen neighbors slay each other. And in that moment, as a 7-year-old, Yemi made the very self-conscious decision that the world is not safe. Kill or get killed. And because of that story and of that attitude that he brought into leadership, he was continually suspicious of the people around him. In fact, he described that he was very clear that his team were trying to steal his company and to steal his role. As I sometimes do with clients, I asked him to describe how he imagined his office and his environment, if we were to describe it in picture. And he said, I experienced my office as being a huge fortress and that there are guards outside protecting me. Now you can already see from this story with Yemi that while he was looking to create an environment of innovation and creativity and free thinking, actually it was not possible, because the kind of leader that he was actually didn't permit for this to occur. And as Yemi was describing the world that he experienced, what he was actually describing was himself. And here's the first key lesson, that as a leader, you see the world always as you are, and not as it is. And that if we recognize that, we start to see fundamentally the impact that our perceptions, our paradigms are having on us in the way that we are being in the world. Just like Yemi, all of us in this room have a story. And here's the thing about stories. Our stories become our allies. And those allies become strongholds. And over time, those strongholds become an identity. And that identity embalms itself around our body, our emotions, our language, the way in which we show up at a very basic level. And we call this the observer that you become. Each and every one of you in this room is a specific observer. And that body that you carry, the emotional ecosystem that is always with you, and the language that you use is what we call your coherence. And it is with this coherence that you drive actions in the world and that you generate your results. And therefore, like Yemi, if there are certain outcomes that you're not experiencing in your leadership journey, it is because there is a coherence that you have not yet cultivated. It is impossible to create outcomes that are outside of what your coherence is. So people then ask me, well, why the body, why emotions, and why language? As I've already said, these things are being embalmed by the perceptions, the paradigms, the experiences that you've had, your culture, your background, your gender, the conversation that we are having in this room. But at a fundamental level, why these three things? Well, firstly, the body, because your body is a unifying force between yourself and the people that you experience. Before we experience anything else, the cleverness of the words that we speak, whether it is the way in which we've learned to present ourselves, we experience this energetic form. And if we are stagnant in the body in which we live, we cannot be dynamic as leaders. Why emotions? Because emotions are your final drivers for your actions. Before any action you take in the world, there's an emotional ecosystem that is driving those actions that you finally take. And why language? Because, well, language is actually action. Your words are containers of power. And if words are containers of power, then language is a universe of either limitations or possibilities. And so what I'm going to do today is take you through this BEL model so that you can figure out for yourself where you currently are, how you reside within yourself, and to see what shifts are available and possible for you so that you can increase the possibilities for your followers, your organizations, your communities, your countries, and also the continent. As a leader, one of the key questions to you is, are the shifts that you're going to make only going to be at a behavioral level, which is what happens when we only change our actions? Or are they going to be at an ontological level, which is what happens when we look at this coherence of the BEL? It's much harder work. It requires commitment. It requires that we be willing to see ourselves. That beautiful poem by Oriah Mountain Dreamer called The Invitation says, I don't care who you worked with, how much money you make, what company you keep, where you've studied. What I care for is, can you sit with yourself, and do you like what you see when you do so? And I'll tell you as a coach that many leaders struggle to sit with themselves. And so this journey is going to be about sitting with ourselves. Now let me illustrate some leaders who I think represent this coherence in parts. So I'm going to split it up. And let me say in the forefront that this is not about politics, because I know these speakers can raise some very big emotions. And I ask you to contain that and watch that. I'm not trying to make a political point. I'm using these leaders because we all know them. But when I think of body, and when I think about mastery of body disposition, I think of Winnie Mandela. Here is a woman who, in the face of real potential harm, sometimes with guns literally pointing at her, was able to cultivate what we call the warrior body. Amandla, with the full power in herself to fight the injustice that she and her community was facing. But at the end of the day, she was able to occupy a different disposition when she went back into her communities to take care of the sick and the elderly and children. Some of us as leaders don't know how to move into a different body just coming from work and going back home, right? We are masterfully charging at people at work, and then we get home and we're masterfully charging at our children and our partners, right? To the overwhelm of them. But here's a woman in really hard conditions who knew how to shift her body disposition for what each moment required. When I think of emotions, I think of Nelson Mandela. Here was a man who, after being in prison for so many years, had all the right in the world to be vengeful and to be angry and to be quite upset, actually. But he said, I recognized as a leader that I had to choose a different emotion if I was to cultivate a healthy country and a healthy transition. I also think of Edith Eger, who is one of the survivors of the Holocaust and danced for Dr. Mengele. And she talked about the fact that while she was in the concentration camp, the thing that kept her going was what her mother had said to her, which is that they can take anything away from you, but nobody can take away what is in your mind. Leadership mastery is the understanding that our emotions are up to us to cultivate and not to the external environment. And when we understand this, we create the right kinds of moods. And I'll explain what this means later. And finally, language. I think of Oprah Winfrey and Martin Luther King, leaders who mastered the use of very simple language, but that created such dynamic shifts in the world. You think of Martin Luther King and I have a dream. Very simple words, and yet those words reverberate even today, across history, continually inspiring us to dream better for our world. And Oprah Winfrey, who said, live your best life. Very simple words that we all understand what they mean and have driven many of us to the search for our authentic power. Compare this to Yemi. Yemi's body was actually the body that we call resolution, but he lived in the shadow of resolution, and I'll explain that a little bit later. His emotions were fear and anger. He lived in an ecosystem of fear and anger, which he masked as great confidence. You would never have told, just looking at him, that he was fearful internally, but he masked it as this marching confidence that was actually very damaging to himself and to others. And we say he was in a mood of resentment. And finally, his language was very dictatorial. He had a lot of declarations, again, never being able to create collaboration, but always issuing out commands. And so today, what I present to you, as I said earlier, is an opportunity for shift. And I'm going to do this through the modality of what we call ontological coaching. Now, ontology, of course, is a branch of philosophy which speaks about the art of being. In ontological coaching, what we look at is this idea of the coherency, which is what ontology represents, but also the very fundamental and important idea that you as a leader are continually co-creating the world in which you exist. And so if always as a leader you are thinking about how you are affected by things, the possibilities shrink. But as a leader, if you're continually asking, how am I causing this? How am I co-creating the environment in which I find myself in? Then there's an openness to possibilities there. The power that is available to you increases. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Richard Strozzi Heckler, who is one of the key proponents of the ontological model, says this: the body we are is the life we live. The self is the leader's primary source of power. The body is indistinguishable from the self. It is essential to include the body if one wants to build the skills of exemplary leadership. Now, in a world that is often very stressful, many of us live a distance from our bodies. Many of us actually aren't even aware of how our bodies are being on a day-to-day basis. In fact, psychology would tell us that 95% of the time we are in our subconscious brain, and so we aren't even present to each moment. And here is an opportunity to see the body not just as an instrument that takes you from point A to B, but actually a very powerful data source and a very powerful form of beingness that is available to you to shift whichever way you need it. Now, with body disposition as the first invitation to shift, we think firstly of our core values. All journeys for leadership mastery, leadership development, your growth, should start with understanding who you are at your core. What did you come to the earth to do? What are your key values? What is your mission? What is your personality? And always to be in honor of that. The body disposition then presents an opportunity for you to be versatile coming from that core. And each body you will see has a commitment, a mantra, a breath pattern, an energy, and a shadow. In this particular session, I will focus on the commitment, the mantra, and the shadow. And then in the workshops, we will look at the breath patterns and the energy so that we can actually cultivate the body. The first body disposition for leadership that is really important for leaders to be able to access is the body of resolution, the body of the warrior, that body that I was speaking to that Winnie Madikizela Mandela adopted when she was in the face of danger. The commitment of this body is getting it done, and the mantra is, it's not about me. And so when we as leaders find ourselves in challenging situations where the environment is not supportive of us, this is the body that we cultivate to get things done despite ourselves. Now, all bodies should be occupied in good measure. When we stay in these bodies for too long, we then start to access the shadow of these bodies, the dark side. Now, of course, if continually we are doing things against the odds, if continually we are doing things despite the environment and despite ourselves, there's an opportunity there to become bullyish. There's an opportunity there to start to abuse others and even abuse self. Often when I encounter leaders who are in burnout, it's because they've been living in the body of resolution for too long. The second body that we can access in leadership is the body of stability. This is the body of the king or the queen. It is the body in which we are comfortable with the seat of power. Now note I say comfortable, not abusing the seat of power. We are comfortable to be seen as the one who has been chosen to create, and this is the commitment of leadership, of stability, fairness, order, clarity, and a creation and maintenance of boundaries. As a coach, I can tell you that I access very many organizations where people are confused about what the vision and the mission of the organization is, where there is no clarity about what is my role supposed to be. And often when I experience that, it is because the leaders are not accessing stability, and so confusion ensues. If we stay too long in the body of stability, you might have guessed it, the seat of power becomes too comfortable, and there we have our dictators. And unfortunately, we have many of them on the continent. The body of openness is the third body. And in this particular body, the commitment is collaboration and relationship building. The mantra of this body is come, let's do it together. This is the body in which we build trust and relationships, but also as leaders, we are not afraid to say, I need help, I am struggling, support me. Often, especially as women, because we are in a world that is not often supportive of where we are trying to go, we may find ourselves closing up. We may find ourselves struggling to be vulnerable and to be honest with each moment because we don't want to be experienced as being weak. And we don't want to be accused of, well, see, this is why we don't have women in the organization. And yet this body is fundamental if we're to build deep and lasting relationships with the people around us. Now, of course, if we find ourselves in the shadow of this body, it means that we have opened up our boundaries too much and we are open to abuse. We are open to people using us. We are open to people even betraying us and us not being able to see that because we are too open. And the final body is the body of flexibility, the jester or the magician. In this body, the leader accesses flexibility, experimentation, risk-taking. The commitment of this body is to do things that are different to what you have always done. And the mantra is, why not? And this body is a very important body for those of us who find ourselves stuck in a specific way of being and doing in the world. I've experienced leaders in organizations when it's the end of year party, they're nowhere to be seen because my employees cannot see me dancing. I'm too important for that. And I say to them, you might need a little bit of flexibility. You might need a little bit of the jester in you, right? Life is not always that serious, right? And so what we're seeing with these bodies is that they create for you a dynamicism as a leader that allows you to pivot from your core into whatever each moment requires of you. Authentic power is not just about being clear of your core values. Authentic power is being able to access these different archetypes of leadership so that you can be more effective. Let's go to emotions and moods. The thing to say about emotions, which people often struggle with, is that your emotions are in fact your own. They do not belong to the environment. They do not belong to the experiences that you're having. You are continually cultivating your emotions. And so again, if I go back to the examples of Holocaust survivors, Viktor Frankl, Elie Wiesel, Edith Eger, as I've just described, in all of their writings, there is a theme that threads its way through their theory and their experience, which is that even when the environment is most difficult, you are cultivating your own emotions. Remember that emotions are psychophysiological responses to a thought. And so they're being created by the internal dialogue that is going on inside of you versus what is happening outside of you. And when we have lived in a certain emotional ecosystem for a very long time, we then get into what is called a mood. So I've heard people often say, oh, I woke up in a mood today. It's not possible. You don't just wake up in a mood. Moods happen and develop over a long period of time because there's a specific emotion that you've been feeling over a very long period of time. Now, moods then become very dangerous because if a leader is in a specific mood, the entire environment is in that mood. Now, I can use an example of a very famous leader who I shan't name, who is a big leader in the world today of a very powerful country. And we all know how the mood of the world has changed because of this one man. The entire mood of the entire world because of this one man. And this is the power of a leader being in a specific mood. And so, as leaders, our responsibility is to watch the emotional ecosystem we are in. Two powerful moods that show we are in opposition to life are resentment and resignation. Resentment is when the leader often and always feels that they're a victim of a system. And we've all experienced these kinds of leaders. I come from Zimbabwe, a country in which our leaders, our political leaders, are perpetual victims of colonization, which ended decades ago. But perpetually, that is the excuse, is that we do not progress because we are victims of a system. Now you will see that once the leader is in this mood, there is no possibility for exploration of creativity, of innovation, of change making, because of course there's someone else to blame. Now, how do we come out of the mood of resentment? We do so by having courageous conversations. We do so by exploring if what we are actually thinking and believing is in fact really true. But we also do so by forgiving the past and letting it go. All suffering is because you wish a situation was something it is not. And this is what keeps us locked in resentment. And so when we finally forgive the past, we can let it go and move into a space of acceptance. Now, this does not mean that we tolerate bad behavior. It just means we accept that we cannot change a past that has already occurred. The other mood that leaders can find themselves in if they're in opposition to life is resignation. And I find a lot of us as a generation, and I'll speak to us as multi-generations in the room, but certainly in my generation, this is the mood I find ourselves in. Resignation is when you know the change that you could create, but you're too afraid. You're too afraid of the consequences, and so you do the safest thing possible without fully immersing yourself. I've often said that while we speak about a crisis of courage, of leadership on the African continent, what we actually have is a crisis of courage. A generation of leaders who will not step up in the same way that leaders of yesteryear stepped up. And so things continue as they are. We shift from resignation into ambition, which is where we want leaders to be, by rejecting assumptions. How often do we hear, for example, in the political terrain, our generation say, oh, but politics is for dirty people. Politics isn't for people like myself. And because of that assumption, we keep ourselves locked where we are. But also we seek different observations. We cultivate a new skill set, because this is what then allows us to move into a space of ambition. The most masterful leaders are more often than not in the space of acceptance and ambition. And it is up to us to consistently watch the emotional ecosystem that we have been cultivating over time, and whether it has become a limiting mood for ourselves and our followers. The final element of the BEL model is language and the speech acts that we use. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And as I said earlier, words are containers of power. And if words are containers of power, language is a universe of limitations and possibilities. You remember that what we said is that your language is in fact your action. As soon as you utter what is within on the outside, you have already acted. It is not just an instruction, it is not just a communication, it is an act in itself. And so leaders do well to be clear about the language they are cultivating, for what moment and for what purpose. And so here are the 4 categories of speech acts that we encourage leaders to be aware of in the ontological model. The first is assessments and assertions. Assertions are things that belong to the observed and could be true or false. So I could say that the stage I'm standing on has a white carpet. Based on what we know so far about science, we cannot really debate that point. That is an assertion. An assessment, on the other hand, is something that belongs to the observer more than it belongs to the observed. So it is the example of me saying, this is the ugliest carpet I've ever seen in my life. That belongs to me. It doesn't belong to the carpet, right? And so being aware of that as a leader is being aware of how we are creating limitations in our own world. If I go back to the same assessment I used earlier, when we make the assessment that politics is only for dirty games and for dirty people, we keep ourselves locked in a specific reality because our language is the action in which we are existing. The other very powerful speech act is declarations. Declarations are when the leader understands that through their language, they can create out of nothing something. So one of the most important declarations that we may know of from the Christian religion is the I am that I am. The idea that my I amness is actually independent of what you think or feel, I just am. This is the same thing as a leader. When the leader says, I am courageous, I am committed, I am in this game with you, I am available, I am ready, it then creates a different realm of possibilities for the people who are following us, right? But also with declarations, it's when we realize that we can, without support from the outside environment, be courageous enough to dare to dream differently. So I made my most powerful declaration some years ago when I resigned from my very comfortable role at Yale University, where I was the head of Africa, to move back to Zimbabwe, a country in which I have no medical aid, in which we have power shortages for about 20 hours a day, in which our hospitals and our roads are death traps. And I made a declaration that I will make a difference. I will use my life as a container for creating possibilities for leaders. And I felt that when I was away from the continent, I was really giving my best years and my best skills to a country that was actually in fact going to be fine. Believe it or not, America, even with Donald Trump, will be fine. And yet here I was coming from a country that was truly grappling and struggling. And so declarations are the spaces in which we create a new reality despite the environment. Requests and offers are the speech acts that we cultivate when we want to change the trajectory of the future. And the power of our requests is about how committed we are as the speaker to that request or that offer. I'll tell you that many leaders suffer because they don't know how to ask a question. All-knowing, all-capable, and so never able to say, please can I have help? And also sometimes unable to offer the support that is needed by the followers around them. And so with this speech act, we adopt it when we want to drive the future in a different direction. And finally, promises, commitments, and agreements are the space in which we create trust, relationships, success, and self-esteem. We know that the quality of our productivity in an organization are about how good we are at keeping promises, agreements, and commitments, and how good we are at breaking those promises, agreements, and commitments when we need to, instead of again creating a blame for why we were not able to deliver the way that we should have. And so when we do our workshops, we will explore what are the speech acts that you currently live in as a leader, and what are the speech acts that you could start to adopt to be much more effective in the space that you're in. I will end with the story of Yemi today. So after I had done work with Yemi, he decided he was going to close his business and start again. So off he went to business school to learn a bunch of skills that he didn't have that would allow him to be in the kind of ambition that he needed to be in, but would also allow him to heal from the resentment that he had been swimming in for so many years without recognizing. Today, BME is actually an internationally recognized entrepreneur, an award-winning entrepreneur, and the dream and the vision that he had for his organization is finally coming to light. I watched him give a speech the other day when he was receiving an award on YouTube, and was amazed that the first thing he acknowledged was my team. Me and my team have been able to do this. Me and my team have worked together to make this happen for the world and for Nigeria. And so my invitation to you today is that transforming the world, transforming your organization, transforming your country, isn't about changing the world around you. It is about changing yourself. And if you can take that journey within to make the shifts that allow you to be more effective as an individual, but also as a member of society, then that is the best chance that we have of changing this continent.